I will see if I can share my screen. Um, okay, so it should be popping up in a moment. Are you able to see this okay? Excellent. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming along today. And yeah, I really hope that I can sort of share some interesting, useful things in this talk, but also I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And the reason I chose this cover picture was on this topic of navigating collaborations. Most of the useful stuff I learned was sitting with people discussing things over coffee, not usually in such a scenic location. Usually it was in some kind of institutional coffee room, but yeah, it was those informal discussions where I learned the most. And so I also hope that this can be a bit of an informal discussion to allow sort of sharing of that learning and learning from each other as well. But also partly maybe a bit of a social commentary on often these really important discussions happen over coffee, but not necessarily in slightly more formal spaces. And so, yeah, this is part of what I hope we can do today. Also, just before we get started, just to share a bit of background information, because it might be useful for some of the discussion later on. Is my own background is I was trained in the natural sciences originally, so I trained as an ecologist, working in the Arctic, and then I eventually went on to do a PhD in biosciences and anthropology, and then in the intervening years I've been working a little bit still in the natural sciences, but also working a lot more in the social sciences and sort of human geography and fields like that. And I just mentioned this because some of what we are talking about today is sort of, there's very different levels of comfort with this information, depending on which disciplinary background you come from. Some of this material is a lot more obvious to people in the humanities, but also a lot easier to apply in humanities contexts. Sometimes it's a little bit less obvious in the natural sciences, but there's also sort of complexities about applying some of this information as well in natural sciences contexts. So I just want to sort of flag to you that I have multiple hats and I'm happy to switch those hats around if you have specific questions relating to approaching this from different fields, just because I understand that you might come from quite diverse fields yourself. But with caveats in place, I will get us started. So yeah, so the topic today is talking a bit about navigating collaborations with Arctic communities when we're doing research. And I'll speak a bit about navigating collaborations more broadly, but the assumption is that this is sort of mainly focused on collaborating with Indigenous Arctic communities. And yeah, we can talk about that a bit more in detail in a moment. But to start off with, I wanted to share a bit of a story, and it's quite a lovely story, which I like. And it is about some research on bowhead whales in Alaska in Utqiagvik. So in the 1970s, the International Whaling Commission heard that the number of bowhead whales in Alaska were being negatively impacted by Inupiat subsistence hunting, so Inupiat being the indigenous community in that region of Alaska. And they were really concerned essentially that this was decimating the bowhead whale population and that for conservation reasons, they sort of needed to intervene. And so the IWC called for research into the bowhead whale numbers. So any changes in their conservation management could be data-led, it's good science, and sort of implying that there might be more hunting regulations that go along with that. And so they got in touch with the US National Marine Fisheries Service, who got a bunch of marine biologists on board. And so the US National Marine Fisheries Service is responsible for regulating subsistence harvests in Alaska. And so they got a bunch of marine biologists together. They went out and did a survey counting the bowhead whales, and they found out that there was roughly sort of 2,000 to 3,000 bowhead whales in the area. And this was far fewer than they were expecting. They were quite worried. So a year after this survey was done, the International Whaling Commission set the bowhead whale hunting quota to 0. Now, this kind of concerned the local Inupiat, who had been hunting bowhead whales in the north and northwestern Alaska for generations. And it's concerned them for two reasons. The first was that this hunt is a really important part of their culture. It provides them with food, but it's also kind of a form of cultural expression and a way of enacting their relationship with the natural environment. But the other issue was that they just sort of thought the scientists were wrong. Like they thought the bowhead whale numbers were fine. And they had a bit of a question around the methods that had been used by these marine biologists to do this study. And so what they did was they decided to set up the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission to represent themselves. And they approached the International Whaling Commission and essentially said, can we go out with you onto the land again with these marine biologists and redo the survey because we think you made some mistakes. And so maybe we could work together to collaborate and kind of find out what's really going on with these whales, because it's also in their interest to conserve the whale numbers. And so, yeah, they found out a number of really interesting things. So, for example, when they went out together, it was pointed out that the marine biologists had been following the best knowledge at the time about bowhead whales, that they need to breathe air, so they need to be in open water so that they can these whales can surface and breathe and then go underwater again. And so naturally they assume that when there's extensive areas of ice, the bowhead whale won't be able to breathe, so it won't swim under those areas of ice. So the whale counts were mostly done from sightings from the shore around open water. But there was a couple of issues with this. The first is that if you only do sightings from shore, you actually miss the whales that are way out deeper in the ocean. But the other thing was that there was just some knowledge that the hunters had, which the marine biologists did not. That the hunters pointed out that the bowhead whale actually has this sort of bump on the top of its head, which it can use to punch a hole through ice where ice is particularly thin. And so it can create itself a sort of blowhole through the ice. And that means that the whale is able to swim under areas of ice and still be able to breathe. And so they decided to kind of incorporate this information into the next survey. So they did a survey that went deeper out into the ocean, but that also tried to count the number of whales under the ice as well. And then a few years later, both the hunters and the marine biologists went out for a third time using some new technologies as well. So there were some acoustic technologies where you could hear whales that you maybe weren't able to pick up otherwise. And they found some interesting results. So all of these surveys were done within a few years of each other. So kind of the birth of new whales wouldn't have had too much of an impact. That essentially in the first study where it was just the scientists, they found that there was sort of 2,000 to 3,000 whales. When they went out with the hunters with new techniques, they found actually there was about 4,000. And then when they continued this collaboration and incorporated new technologies, they actually found there was about 7,000 whales. So not only was the whale population sort of actually really healthy, far higher than they thought, but they even found that when they reinstated the hunting quotas to 280 whales being harvested a year, the population continued to grow. And so essentially this is kind of a bit of a good news story of sometimes when there are these kind of collaborations, we can have better information, better knowledge, better relationships with these local communities that allow us to do better science and sort of have more appropriate management strategies of systems. And so kind of this feeds into a wider discussion of how it can be really valuable sometimes to collaborate with local communities and to sort of use both techniques from the scientific community and equipment, but also kind of the knowledge from these local communities. And we know that there's a lot of benefits to collaboration generally. It improves relationships with stakeholders in an area who might be affected by a study or by the results of a study. It might give them a sense of ownership over that research. It might give them sort of, it might provide sort of respect for them and build friendships between these different groups. It can improve the quality of research. So you're drawing on a wider knowledge base and interdisciplinarity, whether this is different disciplines collaborating with one another or different knowledge systems. there's quite good literature to show that working in this way, in an interdisciplinary way, actually actively encourages creativity in research and creates better problem solving when people feel a bit more confident to kind of go out of the normal techniques used within their field. And also it does allow sort of better anticipation of how to effectively apply research. So for example, in land management strategies, resource management strategies, and so on, as we can see with this example of the quotas, the hunting quotas. But these are kind of a lot of potential objective benefits. There's another interesting wider question is there kind of a general moral obligation to be working with local communities when we do research? And I was thinking about this and thinking about actually the field of medicine, that doctors sort of say the modern Hippocratic oath when they become a doctor. And, you know, this is a very scientific field. It's quite obvious that you go and you do things to make people healthier and better. And there's quite an objective reason for why you carry out medical work and medical research. But it's really interesting looking into this Hippocratic oath that doctors are asked to sort of say. So there's various lines to it, but one line says that I will remember that there is an art to medicine as well as science, and that warmth, sympathy, and understanding may outweigh the surgeon's knife or the chemist's drug. I will remember that I do not treat a fever chart, a cancerous growth, but a sick human being whose illness may affect the person's family and economic stability. My responsibility includes these related problems if I am to care adequately for the sick. And I will remember that I remain a member of society with special obligations to all my fellow human beings, those sound of mind and body, as well as the infirm. And I just thought this was quite interesting to read through and sort of try to apply in a research context as well, that we often think the most important thing in our research is getting really good results and then sharing that with the world. But sort of what are some of the wider impacts of our research that we maybe do have some kind of responsibility to think around, how our results will affect the people living in that area or connected to that topic or so on. So with all that in mind, I started my PhD. As I said, I have a background in sort of ecology and environmental sciences, and then I did this PhD, sort of an interdisciplinary PhD between biosciences and anthropology. And I thought I was doing research on reindeer and reindeer herding in northern Sweden, and I thought I really want to do brilliant ethical research. So I want to find out all of these ecological changes that are going on in the system, but I really want to work with the local community, collaborate with them, have them be kind of significant parts of the research and have their voice heard and all of these things. So pretty early on, I decided that this was something I wanted to do in my research. But also very quickly, I found that it was just not really going so well. So I was sending a lot of emails to a lot of people, to reindeer herders, herding organizations, individuals. So in northern Sweden, across much of northern Fennoscandia, reindeer herding is done by the indigenous Sami population. So I was also kind of particularly trying to reach out to the Sami population. But yeah, really, really struggling to get people to get back in touch. And even when I would go to places in person and speak to people, they'd all kind of be very polite and say, that's nice and that sounds like an interesting project. But they would sort of politely hand me off to someone else who would hand me off to someone else who would sort of like it. There just seemed to be a bit of a pattern there. And I realized that in my research, I had this really good intent of doing collaborative work with people, with the local populations, but it just wasn't very effective at all. Like I didn't really get anywhere, and it didn't feel like I was helping them in any way or being a good collaborator. I just felt like a bit more of an annoyance rather than anything else. Which, yeah, confused me for quite a long time. And obviously with the imposter syndrome of a PhD, I was just sitting there wondering how I could possibly be such a terrible human being in my attempts to do research. But this is where all of these discussions around coffee started to come up, that I was amazed with once I started speaking about this kind of all these difficulties with collaboration, how many other people said, oh yeah, I had that issue like early on in my career and it just didn't work, so I just didn't try again. Or yeah, I'm actually kind of dealing with that at the moment and I have no idea what to do about it, but it's really awkward to talk about. And to sort of start to realize that this was a really common problem, but also just, I mean, again, as academics, we kind of like to say when things are going well, and it's not very comfortable to talk about when things are just really objectively not. And so it would all be these very informal conversations. But interesting to know that it was really prevalent. And so then I started sort of trying to look into a bit more what is going on here, and also why are we keeping going in these cycles of sort of making these same potential mistakes or having these same challenges over and over. And there was a number of things I learned in that process. The first was that I sort of had my scientist hat on, thinking that I really want to do something good and I want to solve a problem, and sort of science is an objectively good thing. And I did that without sort of fully realizing how science and scientists can sometimes be perceived in, particularly in Indigenous communities in the Arctic. Because there is a long history of scientists collaborating with local and Indigenous peoples. A quick note here, this is where I'm going to depart in terminology. Often people use local and Indigenous peoples, but we're speaking about the Arctic. We're going to focus particularly on Indigenous peoples. And there is a slight difference because with Indigenous peoples, there is often some kind of colonial history and there's all kinds of power relations with that. So we're going to sort of focus more on that than other general local populations, although not that they're discounted. But yeah, it became a lot more apparent to me that actually many Indigenous and colonized people have a long history of things being taken from them. So this can be land, this can be resources, this can be knowledge, these can be bodies, this can be their own freedom. And that often within this process, their knowledge is devalued, denigrated, or actively silenced. And scientists have played a really huge active role in this. So, for example, Sweden used to be home to the Institute of Race Biology, which you can tell by the name is a terrible thing, but that was a scientific biological institution that did eugenics research, including the local Indigenous population. And so already there's kind of very negative relationships going on there. Scientists, particularly explorers, have had a key role in prospecting for resources to take from an area, or also kind of scientific presence being used to legitimate land claims. So for example, the photo on the left is the Wrangel Island expedition in the 1920s, which went to Wrangel Island, and it was sort of technically a sort of scientific expedition to learn more about the environment. But the hope was that this party, which included some Canadians, if they spent enough time sort of living on Wrangel Island, they could claim Wrangel Island for Canada, which the Russians weren't too pleased about, and they eventually sort of went to kick them off. But as part of that expedition, they had Ada Blackjack with them, who was a fascinating woman, and there's a wonderful book written all about her. But often within these sorts of expeditions, yeah, there has been an Indigenous presence, but often sort of forgotten or erased, or a lot of the knowledge that they shared has been claimed by the researchers or so on, or they have had really negative experiences being these support individuals for these research parties. And that's also not necessarily a historic thing. Obviously, this is from the 1920s, but there is still some of those relationships going on today. And Linda Twahwe-Smith, who is sort of a Maori scholar and has written all about sort of decolonizing methodologies, has said, actually on the first page of her book on the topic, that research is probably one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary. When mentioned in many Indigenous contexts, it stirs up silence, it conjures up bad memories, it raises a smile that is knowing and distrustful. And so, given that I had all these sort of good intentions in my research, I knew that there was probably some sort of slightly negative relationships, but I didn't realize until I really dove into it that just how much of a negative gut relationship there can be for very good historical reasons, which means that people don't automatically trust the intentions of scientists or don't necessarily want to immediately share information with them. And so there's a number of different elements that come into it and challenges in collaboration that are still kind of problematic today. So one concept is sort of helicopter research. When researchers go into an area, they land, they collect a bunch of data, they lift off and they leave again. And sometimes this can cause a bit of ill feeling because there's not really a giving back to the community. It's sort of a bit of an extractive relationship. You go in, you take, and then maybe the local community never finds out how that information is used, or they don't experience any benefit from it. There's questions around acknowledgement, that whether these Indigenous communities and Indigenous knowledge and ways of seeing the world and individuals are acknowledged at all, or whether they're acknowledged only in a tokenistic way, or if they're kind of erased from the whole discussion of the area. If we're speaking about windswept plains that are empty of human life, except that there is a village down the road who has been there for 300 years. So yeah, those can kind of create tensions in these relationships. There is trust and lasting relationships. So of course it seems obvious to say now, but quite often I found that I was just going in and asking people questions and they were like, we have no idea who you are. Like, why would we share information with a total stranger? Like, they were polite, but it was sort of like, it takes time to build trust with an individual or a group enough that they may want to share things with you. And so that's particularly if we're thinking of tight timelines within research, that can be an important factor to consider early on. Another aspect is incompatible timelines. Sometimes certain Indigenous communities, especially those who still live as quite a subsistence lifestyle, they might be very unavailable at certain times of year because it's a time when you go away to a different kind of camp or you're hunting or so on. Or also just kind of sometimes the pace of an academic timeline doesn't fit with the pace of a local community. There's questions of payment. If you're interviewing people, if they're giving up their time, should you be paying them for that and how much? Or if they're kind of working as research assistants or anything like that, people don't necessarily just want to share information for the sake of sharing, but there might need to be sort of something given back. And then a final one is research fatigue. So I haven't actually checked this anywhere, but I've heard multiple people say about the Sami that, and particularly the Inuit as well, that they are some of the most researched people in the world, and that it just gets really tiring when every time, you know, you meet another reporter or scientist, they really want to know what's your traditional breakfast food. And it's like, you don't care anymore. It's just your breakfast food. You don't want to keep having the same conversation again and again because others find it exotic or interesting or exciting. And there was a really interesting blog post actually written by Helga West, who's a Sami theologian. And she was writing about how, you know, she does research on theological topics, but she really regularly gets people reaching out to her, asking her questions about her culture and so on. And that she just got another one of these very polite, innocent requests, asking her to explain things and describe things and to I think was it even to share information for like an article. And she spoke about how she was really wrangling with this, like, oh, I feel obliged to answer, but I really don't want to answer, but I feel like I should, but this is just another one of 1,000 emails. And so she shared the reply that she wrote to this person, which said, "Thank you for your kind message. Unfortunately, I see very little relevance in your study to me personally and my community. Please understand my refusal and don't take it personally. I'm just tired. I'm tired of strangers who constantly approach my people for the sake of science." And so that's kind of encapsulating this idea of research fatigue. So at this point, I've pointed out a bunch of problems, which is not a nice place to stop. Now kind of going on to the slightly more positive side, I want to say that I don't think there's any clear solutions to any of these things, but that there are a few questions we can ask and a few processes to keep in mind that can maybe help us navigate some of these challenges in collaboration, because nevertheless, collaboration can be really worth it. So firstly is asking the question of who actually is the community, who are the people that we're trying to work with. So to take the time to learn a bit about the community you want to work with, their histories, their norms of interaction, and also potentially if there are specific difficult colonial relationships that it's good to be aware of. Good to keep in mind as well that not all communities will react the same to researchers. I did a similar talk like this at a conference, and afterwards an anthropologist who worked in Cameroon came to speak to me, and he said, oh, it's really interesting because every time I go to Cameroon, people are desperate to talk to me. Like they really want someone to just listen to them and to share their story and to give this information. So he had the total opposite relationship to that or experience than I did. And that, again, just depends on the history in the particular community as well. But also to be aware that not all community members speak for their community, that it can be tempting to think, okay, I'm doing research on reindeer herders are Sami. I will find a random Sami person and they will tell me what the Sami think about reindeer. And of course, you know, that is one individual and they might have some relevant viewpoints, but also they might not. So to kind of be mindful that actually who is the relevant person, and that's that community to speak to, either in terms of do we need to speak to many people to get a variety of viewpoints, or is there kind of a designated spokesperson or contact point in that community that that community has sort of in some ways voted or selected as someone who could speak for them. So yeah, kind of important to keep that in mind. And also just being aware of if there are already any structures or guidelines or official institutions in place to sort of interact with when you want to do this collaborative work. And so I'm going to do a little shameless plug about an academic paper I wrote a few years ago. That if you look into that paper, I just list a few kind of mostly Arctic related ones, although there is a Maori one there, but there is some sort of guidelines that could be useful there for working with, say, the Inuit or with Maori or yeah, for many other groups. So just seeing if there's relevant information already out there, particularly written by those groups. Then kind of just stepping back and thinking about the overall process of the collaborative work that you hope to do. So firstly, is it possible to even plan the research with the community from the beginning? This might be something that affects kind of funding and timelines and so on, but that might be a good way to frame a project in a way where it has active benefit to that community and they have a sort of more of a motivation to be involved because it touches on topics that are relevant to them rather than just to the scientists. Thinking about what the short and long-term impacts of the research might be on the community. And also thinking about what are the short and long-term relationships with the community. Sometimes it will just be a short-term relationship. You will go do the research together and then it will finish, but sometimes it is valuable to think about, you know, will we come back and share the research? Will we continue this project or related projects in the future and so on? But I'm sensitive, I'm sort of getting to time, so I'll speed up a little bit. But there's also just the final few complexities to keep in mind, and this is something we can look at in the discussion. But we also need to keep in mind that what happens if people say no? Like if we just create this wonderful research project and we explain it to the community and how it's great for us and great for them and we think it's the right way forward and they just simply say no, that's sort of a point where we need to actually think about sort of the ethics of different kinds of research. And there's this quote from actually a Sami researcher in the 70s who says, "The structure of the problem presented here is equivalent to those of most Sami problems in relation to the majority people, such as in economics, politics, aesthetics, and so on. It is a sorry fact that, if the minority is to gain the possibility of continued existence, these problems can be solved only by the majority sacrificing something." And that's sort of said in the context of research, but it raises this interesting question of, is the most important thing for us to do our research? Or is there a time when sometimes the most important thing is to respect that maybe research shouldn't be done? And where to draw that line is an incredibly difficult and complicated question. Sometimes it's appropriate to draw that line, sometimes it's not, but it's just something to keep in mind. Yeah, just keep in mind. Also, whilst there's many wonderful reasons to collaborate with local and Indigenous peoples, also local and Indigenous peoples are peoples, and it doesn't mean that they are necessarily always right. And this can be a bit awkward, but yeah, the fact of the matter is they may give information that is wrong. They might have vested interests that influence the direction of research, like academics might as well. and to sort of be aware of that. And we also may, in these collaborations, come up with we might just find that we just disagree with them, that our results, our understanding of the system just sits in opposition to theirs. And so, yeah, these are kind of complexities that we need to be mindful of and that we may need to navigate and find meaningful ways to navigate as well. And also that to me is an important note on the need to sort of diversify academia as well, because sometimes when there are these cases of a local and Indigenous or a representative of a local and Indigenous group is incorrect about something, the reality is it's quite awkward to point that out if you are not a member of that community. Whereas if you have researchers who are also members of that community, it can be easier for them to sort of have that more critical approach just because of power relations and so on. So yeah, it's kind of a value of diversifying academia in terms of who does research. But just as a kind of final point, so raised a lot of complexities, raised a lot of problems, raised some potential processes of solutions. But this always kind of ends with the question of how do we do all of this navigation? Because we can see that, or at least in my experience, having a lot of these conversations with a lot of people, is that there was sort of a repeating cycle of mistakes. Constantly the same communities were approached again and again in inappropriate ways, but just by slightly different individuals. And it shows that we're often not learning to improve our process or practice as an academic community. And so, like developing any process or concept or idea, we kind of need to engage in a bit more systematic learning to be able to do this more effectively. And that involves firstly open and honest sharing of experiences in an environment of mutual support and growth. We need to talk about what goes well, but also what doesn't go well, so we can sort of work out how to do better. To critically approach our experiences, even if it's uncomfortable. So for me, a big part of that was thinking about, well, initially I had the mindset of I had a good intention, therefore I must be in the right, but actually critically assessing that and thinking, well, even if I had the good intention, it doesn't mean that what I did was right, and these were actually potentially missteps that I took. Taking into account all of the data, so listening to what other academics have to say about this topic, but also maybe listening to what some of those communities have to say about this topic. And also keeping in mind the interplay between universal truths and local realities. So as I mentioned, the difference between my experience and the experience of the researcher in Cameroon, that there are general universal truths related to our research about respecting local communities and so on, but the localized realities for him and for me in how we practice that were very different. And also just with ourselves, with one another, being patient, kind, and forgiving, that as we are going through a learning process, there will likely be a lot of mistakes, and rather than sort of feeling very bad about that and sort of dropping it and running away to safer territory, to sort of try and stay within that space and to try and learn, but also to be patient and kind and forgiving when that learning doesn't go so well, or when it's at a rocky patch. And then finally, just sort of reflecting on what is our individual responsibility. We do, I believe, each have an individual responsibility, but also potentially thinking about what is an institutional responsibility, because as I said, a lot of these discussions are a lot more prevalent in the humanities, whereas it can be a lot more, unfamiliar in the natural sciences, where they're not reading sort of a lot of literature on this topic. And so to expect every natural scientist to get a second degree in the humanities, decolonial studies is maybe unrealistic. And so I think there is a question there about when you're getting all of your departmental training, when you start in a new department or a new course, is there an institutional responsibility to kind of provide a bit of a flavor of education on these kind of topics? So with that, I will stop speaking and say thank you very much for coming along, and feel free to ask any questions or share any thoughts. I have a few prompting questions, but I understand that we might do a Q&A first, and then I'll put up the prompting questions. So yeah, at this point, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilona. That was fascinating. Yeah, anybody who has any questions